My name's David Schlundt. I'm an associate professor of psychology at Vanderbilt University. And what I want to talk today about is obesity and diabetes. And I want us to begin to see it in a little bit different way. I really want to present to you the ideas that it's really being caused by a mismatch between people and the environments in which they live. If you look at the maps here, these are the obesity maps from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. You can see that it started in 1990, and what happened between 1990 and 2010 is that we went from no more than 15% of the adult population in any state was obese to, by 2010, over 30% in many of the southern and midwestern states were obese. Now, we can't compare the data from 2015 to 2010. They changed the methodology, but the most recent years, those dark-colored states in the South are actually over 35% of the adult population is obese. So what I really want to do today is think about how did this happen? Why did it happen so fast? Why is it different from one state to the other? And then really, what can we do about it? And how can we think about it in a way that leads us to some new and innovative solutions? I'd like to introduce you to Cassie. Cassie is my 15-pound calico cat, and Cassie has a weight problem. Let's think for a minute about what Cassie's problem is, and I want to approach it from a couple different perspectives. So let's start out with a medical model approach and think about, well, what could be wrong with Cassie that's made her so fat? Well, it could be something about her genes as a calico cat. It could be that calicos lived in a certain environment. Maybe they developed thrifty genes. Maybe they have a low metabolic rate. Or maybe it's a hormonal issue. Cassie was spayed as a spayed female when she was a kitten. Maybe it's this lack of hormones that's changed her eating, her appetite, her metabolism. So from a medical model, what we're going to think of is obesity is a disease. And what we need to look for is the pathophysiology that's causing the disease. Now, since I'm a psychologist, we'll take a psychological approach. Now, you have to understand Cassie's background. Cassie was dropped off in the neighborhood and actually lived out on the street by herself for a while, surviving eating mice and lizards and other little critters. I think it's fair to say that Cassie experienced a traumatic kittenhood. The food insecurity may have made her very anxious about getting enough to eat, and so that whenever she sees food, this anxiety, this trauma comes forth, and Cassie eats and eats and eats, and that's caused her obesity. It's a psychopathology, and maybe what she needs is psychotherapy, maybe she needs behavior therapy, well, maybe she needs anti-anxiety medications, who knows. But let's just take a step back for a moment and let's think about the environment in which Cassie lives. Well, when Cassie was adopted, she had sort of two loving humans who brought her into the house, treated her like a princess, make sure she has everything she needs. I mean, we take care of her from combing the dingleberries out of her butt to treating her cardio-obstructive myopathy. And she gets fed every day. She gets a quarter can of Whisker Lickin's classic pate and a quarter cup of that, the top of the shelf cat food, the stuff in the little silver bags at the top of the shelf in the grocery store. I basically put it out all day. She has 24-hour access to food, and once a day she gets this unbelievably delicious wet food. So I really think what Cassie's problem is, it's not her pathophysiology or psychopathology. It's the people that feed her that have made her fat. It's her environment. And so that's what I really want to think about today, is how if we sort of change our perspective a little bit to think about the obesity problem and think of it not as an individual issue, lack of personal responsibility or disease, but an issue of how people interact with their environments and how that might be driving the obesity epidemic. I had the great opportunity to work with a project called Reach 2010 from 1999 to 2007. We were trying to reduce health disparities in North Nashville among African Americans. We had 4 different goals. We wanted to improve access to health care. We wanted to screen for undiagnosed cases of diabetes and hypertension. We wanted to help people either quit smoking or not start smoking in the first place. And then we wanted to address weight management by promoting healthy eating and active living. As a part of evaluating this project, we did a number of community telephone surveys, very much like was done by the CDC to create those obesity maps. We were able to know the location of each household, and we were able to map them. And we could map down to the neighborhood level and look at the rates of things like obesity or hypertension or physical activity or eating behaviors. And what we saw were tremendous differences in these outcomes by neighborhood. One day I got in my car and I started driving around town with my camera, and I just started taking pictures of the houses in different neighborhoods. And when I came back, I arranged some of them around this map. This is a map of diabetes prevalence. The lighter areas have a very low prevalence, around 2%. The darker areas have a much higher prevalence, around 12%. If we start at the upper left corner, we're in North Nashville. Smaller houses, the second one's an abandoned house with an overgrown lot, high rates of diabetes in North Nashville. Across the river toward Bordeaux, we see an older home and a newer, sort of very inexpensive apartment building, and again, high rates of diabetes. If we turn the corner and come down the right-hand side, we get over in Inglewood. Inglewood is a very different part of town. It's got 1-acre lots. It's got 1950s and 60s ranch houses, very, very well landscaped, nicely wooded, and it's a much lower rate of diabetes. I go a little bit to the west. I get along Dickerson Pike. Smaller houses, less expensive, not as nicely landscaped, higher rate of diabetes. The bottom right corner is historic Edgefield with the gentrified Victorian houses. Even more so today, the diabetes rate was lower there. The little shotgun shack with the tin roof is in South Nashville near Greer Stadium. High diabetes in that neighborhood. If I cross the interstate to the west, I get into the Belmont area. Much different set of houses, much lower rate of diabetes. And then the last two on the left-hand side bottom are Belmead and Westmead. And again, those are very, very nice houses and very low rates of diabetes. What I really ended up coming away from this exercise with was an understanding that I could probably go to any neighborhood in any city in the United States. I could take a look at the housing, and just from looking at the housing, I could come up with a reasonably good prediction of what the rate of diabetes and obesity was going to be in that neighborhood. It really taught me that environment is very important in these things, and that we really have to think about how the environment may be actually driving the rates of obesity and diabetes. The equations here on the blackboard come from a very well-known psychologist, Kurt Levine, and it was his attempt to sort of come up with a big picture of how we understand and can predict human behavior. So the three elements of the equation, B stands for behavior, P stands for person, E stands for environment. The first equation is behavior is a function of the person. He labeled this organismic theories. So we can actually think of two very important organismic frameworks that have been used to understand human behavior and understand obesity. One is psychoanalysis, and the idea there was these unconscious desires from our id were modified by the instructions in the superego and the ego's attempt to sort of manage the anxiety from these desires, and that basically this personality, this psychodynamic personality arising from within is what caused our behavior. Today, the sort of version of that is what I would call biological reductionism. It's sort of the neuroscience or cognitive neuroscience. And the idea there is that, well, everything is caused by the brain. All of our choices and behaviors are caused by the brain. And if we could just understand the brain well enough, really get down to the very, very basic level, we could really understand people and their behavior. After psychoanalysis in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, an environmentalist perspective developed. The second equation, behavior is a function of the environment. This was the learning theories that came out of the classical conditioning of Pavlov, and sort of the best known of the operant conditioning was B.F. Skinner. Their idea was that all we had to really understand were sort of stimuli and reinforcers in the environment, and we could understand how people's behaviors shaped by their environment. By the late 70s, early 80s, people were sort of growing, well, we don't really think that's true. And we really get to the third equation that Levine called interactionism. It basically says behavior is a joint function of both the person and the environment. This led learning theory to become social learning theory. Today it's called social cognitive theory. The health psychologists in the 80s and 90s, in order to understand people's behavior and their health, developed what they called the biopsychosocial approach. So to understand disease, you have to understand the biology, you have to understand the psychology, and you have to understand the social and interpersonal environment in which that person lives. It's eventually led to what's, I would say, the dominant framework in public health today. We call it the social ecological framework. It's really an example of what we call complex systems theory. Now, in a systems theory, we think systems are made up of component parts that interact together, and the interaction of these components is such that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So systems have this dynamic behavior that can't be understood from the parts alone. Now, in complex systems theory, we take an analysis, a level of analysis for a problem, we isolate the systems and its components, and then we want to understand how those are embedded into higher level systems. When it comes to obesity, here the implication is we have to understand the person as a system, and then the environmental systems in which that person is embedded and lives out their lives. Now, this is a diagram that Sherry Barkin and I published a couple years ago. In the center, we have the self. As you move through time and you're making choices and decisions and behaving in certain ways that have implications for your health, let's say your eating and your exercise. The yellow area represents that of which you are consciously aware. Above the blue line, it's your immediate environment. Below the blue line, it's those aspects of yourself that you're aware of, your thoughts, your feelings, your sort of physical sensations, things like hunger and thirst. Now, if we go down below within the person, we take kind of a reductionist science. We begin to break it down into smaller parts, into organs and organ systems, into cells, into subcellular mechanisms, all the way down to the DNA, and really begin to understand how the body functions and how that eventually comes to influence our choices in everyday life. If we look above the blue line, we see that not only are we surrounded by an immediate situation of which we're aware, there's also these layers of environmental systems above us. So there's a social system, social networks, families, there's communities, neighborhoods, there's political systems with public policies and rules, there's economic systems, and there's geophysical systems. So we can even think about how climate change and food production and weather can ultimately come to influence our behavior. I had one of those aha moments. If you think back, you may remember when gasoline was about $4 a gallon. And I would come into work, I would get off and go through sort of an industrial area on the work as a shortcut. And suddenly I saw these sort of middle-aged, kind of doughy, overweight people riding their bikes in the morning out towards Cockrell Bend. I thought, what is going on? And it sort of realized, well, gas is so expensive, they're trying to save money and bike to work. So essentially what we had was Wall Street speculation, civil war in Nigeria, political problems in Venezuela, drove up the price of a barrel of oil. This cascaded through these environmental systems to the point where people started making different choices. I think I'll ride my bike. Now, were they able to stick with that choice? That would have had great implications for their health and for regulation of body weight. This is a picture of the internet. The internet is a system of interconnected computers, a giant system of interconnected computers. So I want us to think about this for a second. We can think about the internet as a system. It interacts with our social networks through things like Facebook. It interacts with the economic systems through online commerce. It's a very, very complicated thing that's really been very persuasive influence in our lives. It's changed a lot. But if I approached it as a reductionist, I might say, oh, routers. Routers are very important. The internet couldn't function without routers, and so I'm going to study routers and know everything there is to know about routers. The problem is I might learn all there is to know about routers, but I still wouldn't be able to put it back together and study and understand how the internet has become such a big part of our lives. And I think the food intake and obesity is the same way. That if we try to break it down to hormones or neurotransmitters, we'll understand those pieces. And yes, the internet couldn't function without routers. And yes, we wouldn't regulate our food intake without these hormones and neurotransmitters. But just by studying the pieces, it really doesn't tell us what the whole is. And it really doesn't allow us to understand what the problem is. Now, when I first got here in 1985, I joined the Diabetes Center. And one of the things we were working on is health communication, teaching nurses and dietitians to help people manage their diabetes better by becoming better. We called it back then diabetes educators. One of the things we stressed was problem solving. And we said, well, problem solving is a process that you go through. You start by identifying the problem. You begin to analyze the problem. That allows you to move on to setting some goals, brainstorming solutions, coming up with a plan, implementing the plan, measuring the results, adjusting the plan, re-diagnosing the problem. And I think part of what's happened here, well, we did a lot of role-playing with that. So we would give the nurses and dietitians, we'd have one of them and we'd give them a little scenario, and then the other one would have to role play like a clinical interaction. So in one of them, I wrote down on the card, you're binge eating late at night and it's caused you to gain a tremendous amount of weight. And so the dietitian started that interaction and she said, well, tell me a little bit about what you ate yesterday. And the person started out describing bacon and eggs, and biscuits for breakfast, and the dietitian sucked air through her teeth and said, well, we've got to talk about bacon, and then launched into sort of this teaching session about the evils of bacon. Now, the problem was she missed the real problem. The problem wasn't bacon. The problem was nighttime binge eating. Bacon was a very minor thing in comparison. And I think that's what's happened with our understanding of obesity and the obesity epidemic. We haven't analyzed the problem in sufficient detail to really understand what it is. And what I'd like to suggest that the problem is not so much that it's the person at fault, it's an interaction between person and environment. And this is what's caused obesity to skyrocket so quickly and become so widespread. A couple summers ago, I got some GPS trackers and to really just begin this process of studying how people interact with their food environments. I've got two maps up here. One is on the left is the macro map, and the one on the right is the micro map. On the left, there's three of us that wore the trackers. I was the green. You can see I drive in from Ashland City every day, have 3 or 4 different routes that stick mostly in the north and west side of Nashville. One weekend night, went out to visit a friend in Goodlettsville, took a little bit different route home. So boring. Dr. Novak is the yellow at the bottom. She lives in Brentwood, has about 4 different ways she drives to work, and that's all she did during those 2 weeks. The brown one was one of our summer STEM student. He was a high school student. He didn't have a car. He spent most of his time on that little dot there in the center, which is the Vanderbilt campus. He took 2 trips in cars, one to the Target on White Bridge Road, one to the Walmart on Charlotte Avenue. I concluded a couple things from this. One is that our lives are really not that exciting. We basically have these corridors that we move back and forth in our environment, and that all of our food resources are somewhere along these travel corridors. If you look on the right, it's the the cloud of green dots is around Wilson Hall on the Vanderbilt campus. The little cloud that's off on the bottom right is the subway just down the street. It basically shows me hanging out there, working there, and eating lunch at Subway. Nick came over a number of times. Lori came over once. So again, it was beginning to really think about how can we rethink this idea of food and weight management and see it not as a pathophysiology or psychopathology, but see it as a person-environment interaction. So I'd like to say that obesity really represents a mismatch between the individual and the environment. If you think about human evolution, we evolved as hunters and gatherers. We descended from primates that maybe were even scavengers, and that our environment, our evolutionary environment, was one in which there was frequent food scarcity. So those who would eat more than they needed when food was available, survive to reproduce. So essentially, we have a biological system that's programmed to overeat so that we can store up energy in case we need it later when it gets scarce. Now let's think about the evolution of human food and food systems. So for hundreds of thousands of years, it was this hunting and gathering, small tribes moving around a lot. Around 11,000 years ago around the world, we saw the development of agriculture. Now, agriculture was really very important. It meant a smaller number of people could support a larger population. It allowed for the development of cities, for specialized labor, leading to things like art and science and music and everything that we really think of as the evolution of our civilizations. Around the 19th century or so, we had this sort of second big shift in agriculture where it went from essentially a human animal-driven process to a mechanized process. So we got the chemical fertilizers, we got the tractors and all the mechanized instruments, and a very small number of people could produce enough food for a very large population. If you look at that graph, that's the graph of the human population through history. And essentially what it shows is our population was really very stable, way under 1 billion people until sometime in the 19th century. And then this second agricultural revolution, along with modern medicine, led to an exponential explosion of the human population to where we're really approaching 8 to 9 billion people in the near future. In the 20th century, I think we entered the third phase of human food evolution, and I'm going to call it the industrial phase. Maybe we can date it to 1928 when Spam was invented, but food is very different than something that's produced on farms and brought to people. It's actually giant multinational corporations that manufacture food, produce it, distribute it, market it. Instead of making a profit off of selling food from the farm to the store, the profit is sort of pulled out of the system at every step along the way. So what we've got is a industrial food system designed to make profit for large corporations and not to really feed people healthy foods or to keep them healthy. At the same time, our transportation environment changed. We got machines, we've got electronics, we don't do hard labor anymore. Unless you live in a large city with a subway, you mostly do your transportation door to door by automobile. So what I'd like to suggest is that it's a mismatch now. We've got this evolved organism set to sort of live through times of food scarcity in a world now where people are making money, keeping us fed all the time, putting fast food restaurants on every corner, making sure that we never, never, never go hungry. And the problem is we've just kept eating and eating and eating. We don't need physical activity anymore, so we can't burn it off. I think that's driven the obesity epidemic. So to summarize, we're not solving the right problem. We're looking at it through blinders and saying it's a problem of obesity as a disease. We need to find the pathophysiology. No, it's a psychological problem. We need to find the psychopathology. And what I'm suggesting, it's actually a person-environment problem, that our organism no longer matches the environment that we're in, and that a unintended consequence of that is this rapid population gain in weight and the development of chronic diseases like diabetes. So in order to really begin to address how do we solve the problem, well, it really is going to take transdisciplinary teams. It's going to take people with expertise in biology and psychology, in economics, in transportation, in food production and distribution. We're not going to be able to fix the person. We're actually going to have to think about fixing the environment and making a world where it's much easier for people to make healthy choices. So I thank you, and that's it.